Okay, now that I've switched into a print format version, I can make a copy, or make a new layer rather, lock the sketch underneath, and now my brush tool works. So notice here, when I try to use the brush tool, it doesn't work, and that's because I opened up a JPEG, and Illustrator tries to save memory in its processing as much as it can. But as a print file, by saying File, New, and setting it as a print file, I'm able to use the brush options. And what I want is a black fill and an empty stroke. And that way, when you use the brush, it gives you a stroke line that you can control that cleans itself up as you go and works a little bit more like an ink pen, especially if you choose one of these specific brushes. I like the 5-point oval. So let's see how that works. Too big. Let's go for the varied line weight with the 3-point oval. See, and it cleans it up as I go. And if it feels too small to or too big to you, and it does a little bit, this is why we keep them on different layers. I'm going to take my sketch layer. I'm going to use the large selection tool. It's just a JPEG. I'm going to hold down Shift and Option and let it fill up the artboard. I'm going to select all of these and delete them. Okay, lock it again, and now I'm all set up. And now I can digitally ink my image. And I can zoom in as I need to. And instead of having to connect every line, I want the 3-point round. Instead of having to always close each path like I do with the pencil tool, this way I'm able to just ink. Now it automatically does it as a stroke. So these are all individual strokes, which aren't so scalable, but are perfectly clean line work. And it's the difference between what I call a sketching line and an animator's line. We want it to be a very smooth, kind of refined line for this. And this helps, just like it does in Flash, this helps us do it. Now, unlike Flash, this is easier to output as an EPS file. And unlike Flash, I can zoom in or out and I don't lose the width of the brush. So I can keep it consistent with my tools instead of with how I fit it on the screen. So that's one approach to digital inking, and it works fairly well. Another approach is to simply ink it traditionally. So to take a piece of tracing paper and ink it that way. But either way, what we want at the end of the day are vectors for our outline, a clean EPS. So another approach to digital inking, we could try to do a similar thing in Photoshop. Let's say we wanted to avoid Illustrator completely. So if I open up the sketch in Photoshop, just like it has shape tools that are vector tools, it has some stroke tools with its pen tool that are similar. So the same thing, I'll make a new layer. And I'm going to use black as my foreground color. And I will use the freeform pen tool. But before I do that, I need to pick a brush. And I'm going to pick a brush that, yeah, it's kind of like an inking brush. Or that has a size and a certain hardness. All right? So this is the weight of the brush. This is just painting. So that's about right. That's what I would do if I wanted to just ink it in Photoshop. But if I just use the brush tool like this, the problem is those are based on pixels. That's a raster tool. You see, and so the strokes are not nearly as clean as they are in Illustrator. But if instead I use the freeform pen tool and I draw the shape, whether I connect it or not, it will clean up my lines for me, just like Illustrator, though I don't think it does quite as good a job. And then how do I make it into digital inking? Because right now it's just paths. Well, what you can do is right-click on it and say, let's see, make sure I get this right. No, I don't want to free transform the path. You can convert this to a stroke. Yeah, so they just named it a little differently. So if you right click on it and you say stroke subpath, it's going to convert what we freeform drew in Photoshop, and we can select it to match up to a tool. And we want to select it to the brush tool, and we want to simulate pressure. And it will digitally fill it in for us. Now I'm having trouble doing the other paths. And that's why this is not as ideal as doing it in Illustrator. But the idea is you use the pen tool, you draw your shape. Even if you don't contain it, you right click on it immediately, you say stroke subpath, and you can link it up to a brush. I think my brush is way too big. So let me change my brush setting to much smaller, because in Photoshop it has to yield it as pixels still, even though you're making it initially as a vector. And then when I do it, let's do his mouth. Yeah, that will be a better size. So in order to select the other ones I already made, I have to hold down Command and click on those. And I can do all of them by holding down Command, clicking on all of them, and then saying stroke path, simulate pressure, like so. But once you do it, it's done. And it's a little different than doing the same thing in Illustrator, because it's always going to have to show them as pixels. But because they were outputted through these vector paths, I can then just make the image size a lot higher, and it will do a better job at rendering the shapes automatically. So those are our different ways to digitally ink. Now, for a variety of reasons, what I often end up doing is just inking it by hand on a piece of tracing paper. Let's see, I had it open. There it is. and then bringing that scanned inked copy. So these are my ink lines. And when you scan something, remember that it scans in as raster, but I scan at about 600 pixels per inch. So even though it's a small inked sketch, there's lots of pixels making up each line. And I can try to clean it up in Photoshop, but I can also, Illustrator's pretty good now. I can bring it into Illustrator and I can say image trace. And I can set it to silhouettes. And it will try to find the black shapes. And then I want to play with different presets. So maybe line art makes sense for this. And then I can customize those presets. So it all takes labor to get a good vector line work, but it's well worth doing. So the line art setting works pretty well, but the problem is it gives me everything as a stroke. And I'd like them to be individual paths so I can change them more easily. So I can also try black and white logo. And this is going to give me closer to what I want. This is going just from my sketch. Now, how do I control the settings? Well, you can use these different presets. You can also click on this box. These are all just the image trace settings. And looking at advanced, and you can play with the threshold. You have to wait for it to preview each time. But the threshold tells you kind of how forgiving do you want to be of the black lines. And I don't want to be that forgiving. But I want to be a little bit more forgiving than that because that leaves openings. You can also play with the most important feature in my mind when you're doing this. You want only the black lines. You don't want the white space around them. So you want to click on Ignore White. And let's say your inking wasn't very smooth. Well, you can smooth it out through these different settings, allowing for more noise or less noise. If there's dirt on and like stray little pieces, allowing for more corners if you want it more accurate to what you drew. If your inking's really clean, or fewer corners if you want it more smoothed out. And you just try to get the best possible result. By clicking on Ignore White, then when I hit Expand and convert it all to just solid vector paths, now each shape is an individual vector path that I can fix with the pencil tool in Illustrator. So for instance, for this path, if I want that little white spot in his eye to be a little bigger, I just select the path and I open it up. Or if I want this to be more self-contained, I select the path. I can try doing this, but that's going to do other things. So instead, I'm going to make it very close. Like so. And then I'm actually going to use the eraser tool. And the eraser tool is a bit of a pain because it only comes in one size. So how do I get it so the eraser tool is better suited to what I want? I take that whole vector path that I outputted, select it all, it's all on one layer. I use the large selection tool, I hold down Option and Shift, and I grow it. So now the eraser tool is a handier size. And because they're paths, it didn't destroy anything that I made. So the eraser tool is needed when you need to break a path. And what that allows me to do is to separate that eye. Then I overlap it with this path. And now I select